A funeral in Kirinyaga, a tribute cut short, a minister, mourners, a microphone. This week, Kenya watched a clip go viral, not because it was shocking, because it was familiar. We have all been to that funeral. We have all been to that kind of funeral where grief becomes a stage, where mourners get policed, where someone with power decides not like that. Today, we interrupt our regular Hesabu to ask, who owns grief? And what happens when the church forgets its job is to hold it, not control it? This is Radio Kenya United. Stay with me. Good evening. My name is Kasisi Kirinyaga, and you are listening to Radio Kenya United, where faith, culture, and real life meet. Normally, Hesabu is where we analyze the headlines, the numbers, the systems that shape our lives. We look at what is underneath the noise. But today is different. This is not about policy or politics. This is about pain, about a funeral that became a confrontation, about a church that made a decision, and now an entire denomination is reckoning with what that decision cost. What you're about to hear is not a verdict. It is not a prosecution. It is an investigation. An investigation into what's at stake when grief meets institutional power. We're going to walk through 10 dimensions of this incident: mental health, church polity, theology, power, and the future of faith in Kenya. So, you will disagree with part of what I say. That's fine. But I'm asking you to stay, because this is not about one minister or one funeral. This is about every funeral where someone decided the rules mattered more than the mourners. And if we don't name what is broken, we will keep breaking people. Let's begin. First, the facts, or at least what we think are the facts. What is circulating online is a viral clip from PCEA Kiangai in Kirinyaga. The video shows what appears to be a funeral service. A group of mourners, widely reported to be colleagues of the deceased, specifically from Family Bank, are giving or about to give a tribute. And then, interruption. The presiding minister, Reverend Gakenya, stops them. According to multiple social media posts, the reason given was format. The tribute was not in the right format. It had not been submitted or approved at the church procedure. The mourners push back. The atmosphere escalates. Voices rise. The ceremony that was supposed to hold grief becomes a site of conflict. Now, here is what we don't know, because as of today, there is no verified media coverage of this incident, no official statement from PCEA leadership. There's no on-record response from Reverend Gakenya, no confirmed identity or statement from the affected group. We don't know if they were actually Family Bank staff. We don't know if there was a prior conflict, financial, personal, or institutional. We don't know what was communicated to the family before the funeral service. What we do know is this: a confrontation happened during a funeral. It was public, it was captured on video, and it went viral. And PCEA's reputation, fair or not, is now tied to that very moment. So, before we get into what that means, let's be clear about what we are working with. Observable behavior in a video, claims circulating on social media, patterns we recognize from other funeral conflicts, and a lot of unanswered questions. That is the landscape. Now, let's dig into what's actually at stake. Let's talk about trauma, because that's what this is about. When you interrupt someone's grief publicly, you're not just correcting procedure. You are creating a wound. Here is how trauma layers in a moment like this. Primarily, this trauma of death. Someone has died. Your colleague, your friend, someone you worked alongside is gone. Secondary trauma, the public humiliation. You start to speak, to honor them, and you're cut off in front of everyone. And of course, there is the tertiary trauma, the loss of voice. You came to mourn. You were told your mourning does not fit the format. Psychologists have a term for this: complicated grief. It's when your loss becomes entangled with shame, anger, with unfinished business. You cannot mourn clearly because the container for mourning broke while you were in it. Think about what a funeral is supposed to be. It is one of the few spaces in society where you are allowed, expected, even to fall apart, to cry in public, to be vulnerable without apologizing for it, to say the things you didn't get to say when the person was alive. That space is sacred. Not because of religious rituals, though that matters, but because grief is sacred. It is the human response to love that has nowhere to go. And when that space gets violated, when someone with authority says, "Not like that, not now, not you," something breaks that cannot be easily repaired. For the group of mourners who were interrupted, they now have unresolved grief. The ceremony was incomplete. They did not get to finish honoring their colleague, the dead. And layered on top of that, grief. And layered on top of that grief is shame. We did something wrong. We embarrassed ourselves. We caused a sin, even though they didn't. Even though they were just trying to say bye-bye to their loved one. For the witnesses, everyone else in that church, they experienced vicarious trauma. They watched people they may have known get humiliated, and now they're asking, could this happen at my loved one's funeral? For the minister herself, because, yes, we need to name this, if Reverend Gakenya believed she was enforcing necessary rules, she's now facing public verification. Her name is attached to a viral moment of conflict. Whether her judgment was right or wrong, she is experiencing moral injury. That is the psychological cost of making hard calls in public and discovering the public does not agree. Now, if the deceased colleagues were indeed workplace mourners, financial sector employees. There is an added layer. Many people who work in banking, insurance, corporate environments, they work long hours, high stress, limited leave, professional culture that discourages emotional expression. A funeral becomes one of the only times they are allowed to mourn collectively, to acknowledge that their colleague was not just a co-worker, they were a person, a friend, someone who mattered. And when that once sanctioned moment to grieve gets interrupted, when they are told their professional grief is suspect, their tribute is inadequate, what message does that send? Your grief is not valid unless it fits our format. Sad, right? Let me be clear about something I don't know. That is Reverend Gakenya's heart. I don't know what she was thinking in that very moment. But I know what trauma looks like. And I know that trauma does not care about intentions whatsoever. The question is not, did the minister mean to cause harm? The question is, was harm caused? And the answer from every angle is yes. That's the mental health cost. Now let's talk about grief itself. If you have lived in Kenya long enough, you know funerals are not small events. We all know that. They are not quiet private affairs where immediate families buries their loved one and goes home. Funerals in Kenya are communal, extended, multiple day processes with ritual structure. They are where social obligations get fulfilled, where honor and shame are publicly demonstrated, where harambees happen, contributions are announced, relationships are solidified. Funerals are economic events, political events, cultural events. And because they carry so much weight, the question of who controls them is always contested. Who owns the funeral? Of course, traditional answer is the family, clan elders, and community. Modern answer is family, church, employers, politicians, and friends. But the real answer, all of the above, and they are constantly negotiating for the microphone. When colleagues get a tribute at funeral, here is what they are doing. They are affirming that the deceased value extended beyond the family. They are saying, this person mattered at work. They were not just an employee. They were part of our lives. They are fulfilling a social obligation. And in Kenya, if you work with someone and they die, you show up, you contribute, you speak. And they are processing collective shock, especially if the death was sudden, especially if they were young. The tribute is part of how a workplace grieves together. So, when you interrupt that tribute, here is what you're doing, even if you don't mean to. You are publicly denying the deceased value in the sphere of their life. You are shaming the speakers. You are breaking an unspoken social contract. Because mourners expect space to speak. That expectation is cultural, not just procedural. And when the church violates that expectation, it signals something. Clergy authority is greater than social obligation. Church rules matter more than communal norms. Now, let's talk about the singing, because according to the reports, the tribute included singing, and that matters too. Singing at Kenya funerals is not entertainment. It is embodied grief. When you sing at a funeral, whether it is a hymn, a worship song, a secular song with meaning, you are doing something physical with your grief. You are giving it sound. You are letting it move through your body. It's cultural continuity. It's collective participation. It is emotional catharsis. And when you stop someone mid-song, you're not just correcting a procedural error. You are cutting off a grief procedure and process mid-flow. You're making the body feel unsafe. And they start saying, I started crying while singing and someone told me to stop. Now, let us address the format question, because if Reverend Gakeni's concern was format, that the tribute was too long or had not been pre-approved or violated some church polity, I want to say this very carefully. Legitimate concerns about format exist. Funerals can become chaotic. Without structure, they can turn into political rallies, personal drama, endless speeches that exhaust the family. Churches, of course, have a responsibility to protect families from that. So policies around tributes, who speak for how long, with whose approval, those are not inherently wrong. But here is the tension. Grief is chaotic. Authentic mourning does not follow schedules. And when format matters more than feeling, funerals stop being containers of grief. They become performance of order. Order serves grief. Grief does not serve order. Let me give you an example of what I mean. Imagine you're at a funeral. The program says tributes are 3 minutes each. Someone gets up and speaks for 7 minutes because they are crying. They are struggling to get words out. They are remembering their friend. Do you cut them off at 3 minutes? Or do you let grief take the time it needs? The answer depends on what you think a funeral is for. If a funeral is for maintaining order, you cut them off. If a funeral is for honoring the dead and holding the living, you let them finish. So when I hear the tribute was not in the right format, I want to know, what does right format mean? Who decided that? Was it communicated? Was it applied consistently? And most importantly, was the format serving the family's grief or the church's preference for control? Because here is what I know. Across Kenya, people are avoiding church funerals? Not because they don't believe in God, but because they do not trust the institution to hold their grief without hijacking it. Sad, right? And that is what is at stake. Let's talk about church discipline and polity. Now, we need to talk about authority because this is not just a grief question. It's a polity question. Who has the right to make decisions during a funeral? And when does that authority become overreach? Let me explain how Presbyterian governance works. Because if you're not Presbyterian, this might be new to you. The PCEA, that is the Presbyterian Church of East Africa, is governed by a structure called Presbyterian Polity. It is not hierarchical like the Catholics or the Anglican churches where bishops have top authority. PCEA Polity is representative. At the local level, you have the session or the CAC session. That is the church elders plus the minister. They govern the local congregation or the parish. And above that, you have what is called the presbytery, the regional body. And above the presbytery is the General Assembly, the national body. Decisions are supposed to be made collectively, not unilaterally. That's the whole point of Presbyterian structure, shared leadership. Now, at a funeral, here is how that authority is supposed to work. The minister presides over the service, determines the order, leads worship. The session represents the church community, approves the venue, supports the family. The family determines burial details, decides who speaks, honors their loved one. But there's a gray area. What happens when the minister's judgment about order of service conflicts with the mourner's need to speak? In theory, the minister has authority to manage the service. But in practice, funerals are pastoral care moments, and a pastoral care requires flexibility. Pastoral care requires flexibility. Now, let's talk about discipline. Because some people defending Reverend Gakenya might say, she was enforcing church rules. That's her job. And I want to say this clearly. A funeral is not a disciplinary space. Church discipline in the Presbyterian tradition, in any Christian tradition, is about addressing sin, heresy, conduct violations. It follows a procedure and a process. It's private admonition, session involvement. Public rebuke only happens after private efforts fail. So, discipline is not administered from the pulpit during worship. It is definitely not administered during a funeral. A funeral is not a disciplinary hearing, a teaching moment about procedure, a time to enforce submission, a platform to win authority contests. That's not what it is. If there was a legitimate concern about the tribute, if the family truly had not approved it, if the group had violated some clear policy, there were ways to handle that. Before the service, private conversations with the group. For example, the family has not approved your segment. let's work this out. Or the session meeting and say, here is why we need to adjust the program. During the service, though, if something absolutely had to be stopped, pull the speaker aside privately. Don't make it a public show or a public confrontation. After the service, follow-up conversation. For example, let's talk about what happened and how we can prevent this in the future. Public confrontation during a funeral, in front of the family, in front of mourners, violates every principle of pastoral care and human decency. It uses grief as leverage for compliance. It turns worship into a power discipline. It damages the church's witness. Now, let's talk about procedural defense, because I can imagine some people saying, but rules exist for a reason. If we do not enforce them, chaos. Let's test that. Possible defense number one. The family did not approve the segment. If that is true, it still does not justify public confrontation. You pull the speaker aside. You say in private, I'm sorry, but the family asked us not to include this segment. Can we find another way for you to honor your colleague? Possible defense number two, tributes must be pre-submitted. If that's a rule, fine. But was it communicated to the group? Was it applied consistently or only to this group? Is the rule flexible when dealing with grief, or is it rigid? Possible defense number three, the service was running long. Valid logistical concern, of course, but time management should not escalate into public conflict. You adjust quietly. You extend the service if needed. You honor the grief, then address the logistics later. Possible defense number four, the content was inappropriate. If the content violated boundaries, if they were about to say something scandalous, harmful, untrue, then yes, intervention might be necessary. But even then, you pause gracefully. You don't shame people. You do not shame people. Here's my point. Every procedural defense assumes rules matter more than people. And Presbyterian polity is about order. Of course, yes, but order serves the body. When order harms the body, elders are supposed to notice and adjust. That's the whole point of having a session. Collective wisdom to prevent one person's judgment from becoming tyranny. So, where were the elders? Did they approve the minister's approach? Did they try to de-escalate? Did they pastor the minister afterwards? Because if the session was silent, that's a failure of polity. One more thing about authority. Who controls the microphone at a Kenyan funeral? This is the question underneath the question. Traditional authority says elders want to control who speaks. Religious authority says clergy want to maintain worship integrity. Political authority says MPs and governors want platforms for speeches. And family authority, the bereaved wanted to be honored by the loved one in a certain way. And the employer authority, companies want to recognize their staff. So everyone wants the microphone, and there's no clear protocol. So what happens? Constant negotiation, frequent conflicts. And when clergy assert microphone control aggressively, when they are seen as prioritizing procedure over people, the public reads it as clergy power is greater than human grief. That's why this movement went viral, because Kenyans are tired of authority figures, politicians, clergy, elders, treating funerals as stages for dominance displays. We just want to bury our people without a power contest. That is the polity question. Now, let's talk about power itself. Power and control. Power and control. Let's name what is happening here. This is about power. Not just authority. That is legitimate leadership, of course. But power, the ability to enforce your will, even when people resist it. At a funeral, clergy controls certain things, the order of service, who speaks and for how long, content boundaries, what's appropriate and what's not, ritual elements, prayers, benedictions, and the committal. That's legitimate authority. That's what a minister is supposed to do, definitely. But here is what clergy don't control. The families grieve. The communities need to mourn. Cultural practices that exist outside of Christian tradition. Political and social dynamics in the room. And when clergy try to control what they don't actually control, things break. There's a pattern that happens when clergy over-control funerals. Mourners feel managed, not ministered to. Funerals become about church rules, not the deceased honor. People start avoiding church funerals. They bury at home. They skip the church service. Trust in pastoral authority declines. And here is what is tragic about that. The church loses its primary pastoral care moment, and funeral offers that moment. Because funerals are when people who never go to church show up, when skeptics are vulnerable, when the unchurched are asking ultimate questions about life and death. And if what they experience is power contest instead of pastoral care, they leave. They don't come back. Now, there's a gender dimension here that needs to be named. And I cannot leave this space without mentioning the gender dimension. Reverend Gakenya is a woman. And if that holds, we need to talk about what women clergy face in Kenya. Women ministers, particularly in the PCEA church and in Kenyan denominations, are still navigating congregations that are not fully comfortable with female authority. They face heightened scrutiny. Every leadership decision gets analyzed. Male elders may undermine them. Congregants may second-guess the lady minister. And there is pressure, sometimes explicit, often implicit, to prove competence through strict enforcement. And some people say, if I'm lenient, That is, lady minister says, if I'm lenient, they will say I'm too soft. Women cannot lead. If I'm strict, they will say I am too harsh. Women are too emotional. Dear listeners and people who watch, it's a trap. So when I see a woman minister enforcing rules in a way that looks harsh to the public, I wonder, did she feel she had no choice but to be strict, to be taken seriously? Was Reverend Gakenya trying to establish authority in a male-dominated space? Was she overcorrecting because she knew male elders were watching? And that's a possibility, given the way she continued reminding people it's about Kiangai. I don't know, but I know the trap is real. And if that's part of what happened here, then this is not just about ministers' judgment. It's about a system that puts women clergy in impossible positions. Now, let's talk about the employer dimension. If the group that was interrupted was indeed family bank staff, that adds another layer. Why do employers send delegations to funerals? Of course, to fulfill social obligation. Show up for the staff. Demonstrate the company's care, that the company cares about her employees. To build relationships with families for future networking. To publicly honor the deceased service. And that is normal. That is expected in Kenyan workplace culture. But if there was a confrontation specifically with family bank staff, social media filled the gaps with speculation. There was, maybe the church owns the bank money. Maybe there was a debt dispute. Maybe the minister had a personal grudge against someone in the group. Maybe it's class tension, educated professionals versus rural church. These are speculation in social media. But none of that is actually verifiable or even verified. But here is why speculation explodes. When powerful institutions, church and bank, conflict at a funeral, people fill gaps with grievance narratives. Everyone has a story about being mistreated by a bank. Everyone has a story about being controlled by a church. So the clip that has gone viral proves something. You see whatever wound you are carrying in that moment. And that is the danger of virality. Truth gets obscured by range. Nuance disappears. Reputations are destroyed before facts are confirmed. People choose tribal and denominational sides reflectively. I have seen the comments. All PCEA churches are like this, too rigid. Women should not be pastors. Banks think they own everything. The minister was right to enforce order. All this we have heard coming from people who have taken sides in a certain way out of their speculative mind. Everyone is defending their tribe. Nobody is asking what actually happened. So, let me be clear about what I'm doing here. I'm not defending the minister. I'm not defending the mourners. I'm just asking questions. Because power is always at work at funerals. And unless we name how power works, we cannot change the pattern. That's the power question. Now, let's talk a little bit about the future. This incident is not just about funeral. It is a symptom. And what is it symptomatic about? It is a credibility crisis facing the church in Kenya. Let me tell you what I think is at stake. I could be wrong, but correct me if you may. When churchgoers watch this clip, here is what I think many are thinking. The church cares more about rules than people. Pastors use funerals to flex their authority. I cannot trust the church to hold my grief. When non-churchgoers watch this clip, this is what possibly they're saying. This is why I don't go to church. Religious people are hypocrites about love. Funerals are safer without clergy. And since I'm speaking this from the diaspora point of view, when diaspora professionals, people working in banks, tech companies, healthcare, watch this, they say, church does not understand modern work culture. Some say my colleagues' tribute would get rejected too. I will plan a secular funeral to avoid this, and we have seen it happen. I've witnessed it myself. That is the credibility cost. And now, let's talk about the generational divide. Because younger Kenyans watching this are responding differently than older Kenyans. Younger Kenyans, particularly the Gen Zs and millennials, they're already skeptical of institutional authority. They value authenticity over tradition. They are quick to call out hypocrisy. They are comfortable abandoning church if it doesn't serve them. But older Kenyans, some are defending the clergy. Of course, saying rules matter, order matters. Some are critiquing the clergy. This was too harsh. But they are less likely to leave the church over one incident. Here is the problem. Trust in clergy does not collapse overnight. It erodes slowly. One incident like this does not make someone leave the church. But 5 incidences down the line, 10, 20, 30 incidents, eventually you stop showing up. The church loses the next generation, not through dramatic exits, but through quiet disengagement. Some will say, I'll show up for weddings and funerals, but I'm not raising my kids in this. And I've heard it as a minister myself, and a Presbyterian at that. Now, let's talk specifically about the PCEA, because I'm a Presbyterian minister, and because this cuts at the PCEA's identity. The PCEA's brand, its reputation, is built on certain things. Historically educated professional membership, strong among Kikuyu diaspora. Presbyterian equals order, education, respectability. But also, we are accused of bureaucracy. We are told we are too rigid and slow to adapt, which may be true. This incident cuts at that brand. People are saying we are the educated church, but yet we cannot handle workplace grief. We value order, but yet we trump pastoral care over order. We are for professionals, but yet we reject professional tribute practices. Here is the existential question for the PCEA church? Can a church built on order and respectability adapt to a generation that values authenticity and emotional honesty? Because that is the real question, by the way. Younger Kenyans don't want order. They want more truth. They don't want respectability that covers up pain. They want honesty that names the pain. And if the PCEA church cannot make the shift, if it stays committed to practice and procedure over people, it will lose the next generation. Now, I want you to zoom out. This is not just a Presbyterian problem. It is a Kenyan church problem. Across denominations, there is a pattern. Mega churches are growing. They offer anonymity, spectacle, no accountability. Mainland churches, like Presbyterian Church, are declining. They are seen as rigid, old, out of touch. House churches and fellowships are growing. Intimacy, flexibility, belonging. Secular funerals are increasing. People are avoiding church politics altogether. Where is the PCEA vulnerable? Of course, we know we have young professionals in church, but comparatively, they are leaving for non-denominational churches, or they are leaving church entirely. This incident reinforces the exit narrative that Presbyterian Church is for my parents, not for me. Oh, haven't I heard that 1,000,000 times? So, what's the path forward? The PCEA has a choice. And this is a church that I love. It can double down on order, defend procedure, protect tradition, and lose the next generation. Or it can ask, what did we get wrong? How did we become a church that holds grief instead of policing it? That second path requires humility. It requires admitting that order sometimes becomes an idol. It requires valuing people over procedure. I don't know if the PCEA is willing to do that, but I know this. If it doesn't, that won't be the last viral funeral clip we will see. That's what's at stake for the future of the church. Now, let's turn to theology and talk about theology, because I'm a theologian myself. Theology and pastoral care. We need to get deeper now, because this is not just an administrative failure, it is a theological failure. Let me explain what I mean before I get accused. From the Presbyterian tradition, here is what theology teaches about funerals. And I hope you listen to me carefully. Funerals are worship services. They are focused on God, not on the deceased. They emphasize resurrection hope, not sentimentality. Order serves proclamation of the gospel. The minister is a shepherd, not a policeman. From wider Christian tradition, funerals are pastoral care moments. The church, as mother, holds grief. it does not judge it. Grace is greater than the law, especially in vulnerable moments. Love covers a multitude of sins, including procedural sins. Now, ask yourself, what did this incident violate? First, the pastoral care principle, do not harm. Interrupting mourning harms the bereaved. Public confrontation adds trauma to trauma. Protecting procedure at the cost of a person, that is pastoral malpractice and pastoral injustice. You don't get to say, I was following the rules, when the rule hurts people. Because pastoral care is about meeting people where they are, holding pain without fixing it is important. Creating safe space for vulnerability. Pastoral care is not enforcing compliance. It's teaching lessons during crisis. It's using the pulpit. It is not using the pulpit for power discipline. Principle number 2 that is literally violated in what we are witnessing in this clip. The grace principle. Grace with a capital G. Mercy over sacrifice. Even if the rules were violated, even if the tribute was not pre-approved, even if the format was wrong, grace in grief is required. Jesus himself broke Sabbath rules to heal people. He said Sabbath was made for men, not men for the Sabbath. Translation here is, rules exist to serve human flourishing. When rules stop serving people, you bend the rules. How much more should funeral rules bed for mourners? And how far should they bed? The third principle that is violated in this clip is the witness principle. The church's reputation matters. Public confrontation damages the Christian witness. Non-believers are watching. And they are judging Christianity by such moments. And if you were just to do, a survey of the clips that have gone viral, this will tell you how true that is. Jesus said, "By this shall all know you are my disciples, that you love one another." Note, Jesus did not say, "By this all know you are my disciples, that you follow procedure." So when I see this incident, I see theological failure, big time. Not just a leadership failure, not just a communicational failure, a failure to embody the gospel of Jesus Christ. Now, let me talk about pastoral malpractice, because that's a strong phrase, and I'm using it intentionally. Pastoral Care 101, what they taught you and me in seminary, is that you need to meet people where they are, hold their pain without fixing it, create safe spaces for their vulnerability, intervene when safety is truly at risk. What pastoral care is not is enforcing compliance, teaching lessons during crisis, using the pulpit for power display, prioritizing institution over person. If this was a teaching moment about procedure, then it was wrong timing in the middle of a funeral, wrong method, public confrontation, wrong message, your grief is conditional on my approval. That's how it sounded. The right time, possibly a week before or in a session meeting. The right method, private pastoral conversation. Right message, here is how we honor both the family and the church. That would be a good approach. Now, there's a deeper theological issue here, and it is the tension, and I'm going to use big words here, the tension between orthodoxy and orthopraxis. Orthodoxy means right belief. Orthopraxis means right practice. The PCEA strength is orthodoxy, sound doctrine, educated clergy, biblical literacy. Unfortunately, the PCEA's weakness, and I'm saying this as someone who is part of it, who loves the PCEA, is orthopraxis, translating belief into compassionate practice. You can have correct polity, proper procedure, legitimate concerns about order. You can have all that and still fail pastorally. The Presbyterian tradition values doing things decently and in order. And that is scriptural because it comes from 1 Corinthians 14:40. Paul's writing about worship that honors God instead of confusing people. But when order becomes an idol, when it's more important than people, it violates the very scripture it claims to honor. Because Jesus also said, the greatest commandment is love, not order, not procedure, not tradition, love. So, here is the quick question every PCEA minister needs to ask. Am I serving love or am I serving order? And when those two conflict, when love requires bending the order, which one should I choose? Or do I choose? Now, there's one more theological question that needs to be asked, and I hope you stay with me for a little bit longer. And it is a question for the elders. Where were they? By God's grace, where were the elders? The session's role, the elder's role, is to advise the minister, to protect the congregation, to intervene when the minister's judgment is in question. If this confrontation escalated publicly, I want to know, did the session approve the minister's approach? Did any elder try to de-escalate the moment? Who pastored the minister afterwards? When clergy make pastoral errors, who holds them accountable? Who holds us accountable? If the session is silent, who speaks? This is a prophetic question. If the session is silent, who speaks? Because the Bible is full of moments when leaders, even good leaders, needed to be corrected. Moses, David, Peter, the list goes on and on. And correction came from the community in all those scriptural moments. So, if the PCEA session watched this happen and said nothing before, during, or after, that's a failure of eldership. Because elders exist to prevent one person's judgment from becoming tyranny? That is the theological question. That is what is at stake for pastoral care. Now, the larger lesson for all of us. For the churches, your primary job as a funeral is to hold grief, not enforce procedure. When procedure and pastoral care conflict, choose people. For mourners, recognize that churches have policies. Engage them ahead of time, but don't let bad policy break your grief process. And for Kenyans, this microphone wars at funerals will continue until we collectively decide. Grief is not a performance to be controlled. It is a human right to be protected. And here is my final word. The incident is a mirror. Some people see a church defending order against chaos. Some see clergy abusing power against vulnerable mourners. Some see a woman minister trying to lead in a space that doesn't trust her. Some see a family whose grief got hijacked by institutional politics. All of those might be partially true. But here is what is definitely true. Someone died. Their people came to mourn. The mourning did not finish properly. And now everyone is fighting about who was right. The deceased does not care who was right. Those who are dead just want their people to be held through the pain. That's what is at stake. Not policy, not authority, not reputation. The simple human need to say goodbye without being told you are doing it wrong. This has been a special edition of Hesabu on Radio Kenya United. If you are listening and you have information about this incident, if you were there and if you're part of the family, if you are from PCEA Kiangai Church, I want to hear from you. Not for got you journalism or got you journalism, but because the truth matters. And right now, we are all filling gaps with speculation. Send me a voice note at our WhatsApp number +1 951 367 8038. That number again is +1 951 356 367 8038. You can stay anonymous if you want. Just help us get closer to the truth. If you are listening on a borrowed phone or someone else's radio, on a bus, at work, download the Radio Kenya United app on iOS and Android. Search Radio Kenya United in your app store. You can also listen online at radiokenyaunited.com. That is radiokenyaunited.com. And if this conversation started something in you, if you're thinking about community, about belonging, about faith, and that doesn't break when life gets hard, join us at jiraniconnect.com/network. That is jiraniconnect.com/network. We are building something for East Africans in the diaspora who are tired of service level networking and want real community. Next week, we return to our regular Hesabu programming, where we do analysis, the numbers, patterns underneath the noise. But for today, it was a different day. It was about grief. To everyone who's buried someone and felt the ceremony didn't honor them the way you wanted, I see you, and I'm praying for you. To every minister who's had to make hard calls in real time and discovered the public doesn't understand, I see you too, and I'm praying for you. And to everyone else carrying complicated grief from funerals that went wrong, you are not alone. This is Radio Kenya United, where faith, culture, and real life meet. I'm your host, Kasisi Kirinyaga wa Kenywa. Thank you for listening.